I have often reflected upon the curious way in which fate seems to select the most inconvenient moments to thrust adventure upon one. It was a grey October evening in 1934, and I had just settled into my favourite armchair at our lodgings in Whitehaven Mansions, anticipating a quiet evening with the latest Edgar Wallace thriller, when the telegram arrived that would plunge my friend Hercule Poirot and myself into one of the most psychologically complex cases of our long association. The boy who delivered it was damp from the persistent London drizzle, and his urgent knock at the door suggested the message was of considerable importance. Mrs. Patterson, our landlady, brought it directly to Poirot's immaculate sitting room, where the great detective sat arranging his morning correspondence with characteristic precision. "A telegram, mister." "Now, Poirot," she announced, marked urgent. Poirot accepted the yellow envelope with delicate fingers, his egg-shaped head tilted thoughtfully as he examined the postmark. "From Deepshire," he murmured, his green eyes bright with interest, "and sent at considerable expense, judging by the length." He opened it carefully, smoothing each crease, and read aloud in his precise, accented English. "Most urgent, you come Greystone Manor at one stop midnight. Guest arrived as predicted, but brought death instead of answers. Stop, Lady Pemberton, murdered. Stop house party, trapped by storm. Stop your reputation, precedes you. Stop will pay any fee. Stop signed, Colonel Henry Ashford. Stop." I set down my book with a start. Murder, Poirot. And what an odd phrase. Midnight guest. It sounds like something from a Gothic novel. Poirot's moustaches twitched with satisfaction. Ah, but mon ami, it is precisely such phrases that reveal the psychology of a case. Someone expected a visitor at the stroke of midnight, but instead of the anticipated guest, death arrived. Most intriguing. He rose from his chair and began pacing the room with those small, precise steps I knew so well, his hands clasped behind his back. "Colonel Henry Ashford," he mused. "The name is familiar. Was he not the military attaché who served with distinction in India?" "I believe so," I replied, searching my memory. "Retired now, I think. Lives somewhere in Deepshire on a country estate. But Poirot, how does he know of you?" "The reputation of Hercule Poirot, it travels, mon vieux. But what interests me more is this midnight guest who was predicted. Someone knew this visitor would come. Someone expected them. Yet instead of answers, there is murder." He paused by the window, gazing out at the darkening street. "And now they are all trapped by a storm, a perfect closed circle, n'est-ce pas?" Before I could respond, there came another knock at the door. This time it was a gentleman caller, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with military bearing and silver hair, his overcoat still glistening with raindrops. Mrs. Patterson showed him in with obvious deference. "Mr. Poirot?" he inquired, removing his hat to reveal keen grey eyes set in a weathered but intelligent face. "I'm Colonel Ashford. I sent the telegram." "Ah!" Poirot exclaimed, advancing with outstretched hand. "But how is this possible? 'Cause you are here in London when your telegram suggests you are at this Greystone Manor in Deepshire." The Colonel's mouth tightened grimly. "I drove through the night, Mr. Poirot. The roads are barely passable, but I had to reach you personally. The local constabulary is competent enough for ordinary matters, but this—" He shook his head. "This requires a man of your particular talents." "Pray sit," said Poirot, indicating a chair. "Captain Hastings, my associate. You may speak freely before him. Now then, Colonel, tell me everything." Colonel Ashford settled himself with military precision, though I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he began his account. "Greystone Manor has been my family home for 3 generations, he began. "Last week I decided to host a small house party. Old friends, family members, the usual sort of gathering. Among the guests was my niece, Lady Pemberton, a widow of considerable means and, shall we say, complicated social connections. Lady Pemberton, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. She is the victim, according to your telegram. Yes. Yesterday evening, Thursday, she approached me in great agitation. She said she had received a letter that morning, unsigned, telling her that someone would come to see her at the stroke of midnight. Someone from her past who knew the truth about Hugh. The Colonel paused, his jaw working. Hugh was her late husband, Lord Pemberton. He died in India 3 years ago under circumstances that were questionable. Questionable in what way? I interjected. There were rumors of financial improprieties. Nothing proven, you understand, but whispers. Lady Pemberton always maintained his innocence. But the scandal affected her standing in society. She became something of a recluse. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. And this mysterious correspondent promised to reveal the truth. So she believed. She was in a state of tremendous excitement and terror. She begged me not to mention it to the other guests, said it might be dangerous for them to know, but she insisted on waiting in her room for this midnight visitor. And what occurred? Colonel Ashford's voice grew heavy. At 5 minutes past midnight, we heard a scream from her room. By the time we broke down the door, it was locked from within. She was dead, stabbed through the heart with a letter opener from the library downstairs. Locked from within. Poirot's eyebrows rose. You're certain? Absolutely. The key was on her dressing table inside the room, and the windows were latched, and there's a sheer drop of 30 feet to the terrace below. No footprints in the flower beds, despite the rain that had been falling all evening. Poirot began his characteristic pacing again. And the other guests? 6 others, besides myself. My son Richard and his wife Margaret, Dr. Thornbury, the family physician, Mrs. Blackwood, an old friend of my late wife's, Major Sinclair, my former adjutant, and— He hesitated. Mr. David Hartwell, a journalist who has been investigating the Pemberton affair for his newspaper. Ah, Poirot stopped abruptly. A journalist investigating the dead husband. Most interesting. And where was this Mr. Hartwell when the scream was heard? In the library with the rest of us gentlemen, playing cards. We had been there since 11 o'clock after the ladies retired. But the Colonel's expression grew troubled. There was a period, perhaps 20 minutes around 11:30, when Hartwell excused himself, said he needed air, and went out onto the terrace for a smoke. 20 minutes, Poirot murmured. Ample time to visit Lady Pemberton's room if one knew the house well. But the locked room, Poirot, I protested. How could he have escaped? That, mon ami, is what we shall discover. Colonel Ashford, this storm you mentioned, it continues? Worse than ever. The roads are impassable. We're completely cut off and likely to remain so for at least another day. The telephone lines are down as well. I had to drive to the village to wire you. Poirot clapped his hands together with evident satisfaction. Excellent. A locked room, a midnight visitor, a mysterious letter. I and a house party trapped by the elements. All the ingredients for a most satisfying investigation. He turned to me. Pack your bag, Hastings. We leave for Deepshire immediately. In this weather, I protested, the roads will be passable for a man with sufficient determination. Poirot interrupted. Besides, every hour we delay allows our murderer more time to arrange their story, to dispose of evidence, to prepare their defenses. No, we must strike while the psychological iron is hot. As I gathered my things, I reflected on the curious circumstances that seemed to surround our cases. A midnight visitor who brought death instead of revelation, a locked room that defied explanation, and a cast of suspects trapped together in a country manor. It was like something from the sensation novels Mrs. Patterson was so fond of reading. Yet I knew from long experience that beneath such theatrical circumstances lay human motives as old as time itself. Greed, fear, jealousy, revenge. And if anyone could unravel the psychological threads that bound this mystery together, it was Hercule Poirot. Within the hour, we were seated in Colonel Ashford's motor car, heading into the storm-lashed darkness toward Greystone Manor and whatever secrets awaited us there. As we drove through the night, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his little grey cells already at work on the riddle of the midnight guest. "Tell me, Colonel," he said at last, "this letter that Lady Pemberton received, was it found in her room?" "That's just it, Mr. Poirot," came the grim reply. "It has completely disappeared." Section 2. The House of Secrets. The storm pursued us through the night like some vengeful spirit, lashing our motor car with sheets of rain and howling wind. Colonel Ashford proved himself an excellent driver, navigating the treacherous country roads with military precision despite the appalling conditions. Dawn was breaking grey and sullen over the Deepshire hills when Greystone Manor finally loomed before us through the mist. The house was magnificent and forbidding in equal measure, a sprawling Georgian edifice of weathered stone that seemed to crouch upon its elevated terrace like some ancient beast surveying its domain. Lightning still flickered intermittently across the sky, illuminating the manor's many-gabled windows in brief spectral flashes. "Built by my grandfather in 1780, Colonel Ashford remarked as we approached the circular drive. 28 rooms, 3 stories, and more hidden passages than you might imagine. The Catholic persecutions left their mark on English architecture, Mr. Poirot. Priest holes, concealed staircases, forgotten corridors. Greystone has them all." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "Hidden passages, you say? And these connect to the bedrooms?" "Some do, though most have been sealed for decades. Still, a man who knew the house well." The colonel left the implication hanging. A gaunt butler admitted us to a marble-floored entrance hall dominated by a sweeping staircase and stern ancestral portraits. Despite the grandeur, an oppressive atmosphere pervaded the house, as though the very stones mourned their murdered guest. "The others are in the morning room," the butler intoned. "They have been waiting." We were ushered into a paneled chamber where 6 faces turned toward us with expressions ranging from hope to apprehension. The tension was palpable. These were people living under the shadow of suspicion. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the colonel, "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." I observed their reactions with interest. Richard Ashford, the colonel's son, was a restless young man whose hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup. Beside him sat his wife Margaret, aristocratically beautiful but pale with strain, her composure maintained by visible effort. Dr. Thornbury, a portly gentleman with a flushed complexion, dabbed nervously at his forehead despite the room's chill. Mrs. Blackwood, elderly and sharp-featured, clutched her knitting like armor, and her bird-bright eyes missing nothing. Major Sinclair stood rigidly by the fireplace, his military bearing intact but his face betraying deep unease. Finally, there was David Hartwell, the journalist, leaning against the mantelpiece with studied casualness while his intelligent eyes darted constantly toward the door. Poirot entered the circle's center, allowing silence to stretch until it became almost unbearable. His green eyes moved from face to face with methodical precision, reading the guilt and fear written there. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said softly, "you wonder why I'm here when the police suffice for ordinary crimes. But this is no ordinary crime. A locked room, a vanished letter, a midnight visitor who brought death instead of answers." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I look not for fingerprints in the dust, but for the lies hidden within truth. And in this room, such lies hang heavy in the air." Poirot wasted no time with pleasantries. Within minutes of our arrival, he requested to examine Lady Pemberton's chamber. Colonel Ashford led us up the grand staircase, along a corridor lined with dark portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our progress. The passage was thick with shadows, and a narrow table beneath a gilt mirror held a vase of dying roses, their petals scattered like drops of dried blood on the polished wood. "The room has been left exactly as we found it," the colonel assured us as we approached the fatal door. "I posted my butler outside to ensure nothing was disturbed." Poirot paused at the threshold, examining the splintered door frame where the lock had been forced. "You broke down this door with considerable violence." "I see. It required 3 men and several attempts. The lock was engaged from within, the key turned fully. We entered the chamber of death. It was a spacious room decorated in feminine taste, with rose-patterned wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains. Lady Pemberton's body had been removed, but a dark stain on the Persian carpet marked where she had fallen. Poirot moved through the space like a hunting cat, his eyes recording every detail with methodical precision. He examined both tall windows, firmly latched from inside, and peered down at the rain-soaked terrace 30 feet below. He studied the narrow chimney, clearly too small for human passage. "The classic locked room," I murmured. "Impossible to enter or escape." "Ah, but mon ami," Poirot replied, approaching the writing desk with sudden intensity. "Impossible things often reveal themselves through the possible." He gestured to the desktop with evident excitement. "Observe, Hastings. What do you see?" I studied the arrangement. Inkwell, blotting pad, various papers. "Nothing unusual, Poirot." "Precisely. Nothing unusual, and that is what makes it remarkable." His eyes gleamed. "The inkwell sits on the left side of the desk. The blotting pad angles sharply leftward. Yet examine Lady Pemberton's diary, here." He opened the leather-bound book. "See the slant of her handwriting? She was right-handed, certainement. The significance struck me immediately. A right-handed person would never arrange her desk so awkwardly." "Exactly. Someone searched this desk hastily, replacing items without considering their natural positions. As someone desperate to find that missing letter." He produced his magnifying glass, examining the desk surface minutely. "And here, faint scratches in the wood where objects were moved repeatedly." Moving to the door, Poirot requested the key. Colonel Ashford produced the heavy iron implement which Poirot weighed thoughtfully in his palm. "Curious," he whispered, studying the metal shaft. "Fresh scratches here, microscopic but telling. This key has been manipulated recently, perhaps with tools." "But it was found inside the locked room," the colonel protested. "So it appeared," Poirot corrected. "But in houses built for hiding secrets, appearances are merely the first layer of deception." He glanced once more at the diary's final entry, his expression unreadable. We must understand not just how Lady Pemberton died, but why she chose to wait for death at midnight. The library at Greystone Manor possessed the hushed atmosphere of a confessional, its leather-bound volumes absorbing sound and secrets with equal facility. Rain continued to lash the tall windows as Poirot settled into the wingback chair behind the mahogany desk, his green eyes fixed upon David Hartwell with methodical intensity. Hartwell entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to asking questions rather than answering them. He was perhaps 35, lean and sharp-featured, with ink-stained fingers and the restless energy of a professional observer. Yet I detected a subtle tension in his movements as he took the chair opposite my friend. "Monsieur Hartwell," Poirot began without preamble, "you have been investigating the late Lord Pemberton's affairs for your newspaper. A curious coincidence that you should be present when his widow meets her death, n'est-ce pas?" "Not coincidence," Hartwell replied, lighting a cigarette with hands that were almost steady. "Lady Pemberton invited me here. 3 days ago, she sent word that she had finally received proof of her husband's innocence." "Ah, and this proof was to be delivered by the mysterious midnight visitor." So she believed. For months, she had been convinced that Hugh was framed for embezzlement, that someone else profited while he took the blame. She said her informant would vindicate him completely. Poirot leaned forward with sudden interest. "You had been corresponding with Lady Pemberton for some time?" 6 months. Initially, she despised me for my articles about the scandal, but gradually she came to see that I sought truth, not sensation. She began providing documents, letters, evidence her husband had collected before his death. His death, which you believe was not accidental. Hartwell's eyes sharpened. A convenient riding accident just before the investigation concluded. I think Hugh Pemberton was murdered to silence him. And yet, Poirot observed mildly, when this crucial midnight meeting was to occur, you absented yourself from the card table. For 20 minutes, I am told. A flush crept up Hartwell's neck. I went onto the terrace. I needed to see who this informant was. If Lady Pemberton was finally to get her vindication, I wanted to witness it. In that storm, I interjected incredulously. I went to the east wing, beneath her balcony. The rain was fierce, but I could shelter partially under the stone overhang. He drew deeply on his cigarette. I watched her window for nearly 20 minutes. And what did you observe, monsieur? Hartwell hesitated, then leaned forward intently. A shadow moved against the curtains. But it was wrong, somehow. The silhouette was hunched, distorted. Not the shape of a normal person. Poirot's eyebrows rose delicately. You could see a shadow through heavy velvet curtains from the garden below. There must have been a gap, or perhaps the fabric was thinner than it appeared. No. Poirot's voice cut through the explanation like a blade. I examined those curtains most carefully. They are thick velvet, completely opaque. No shadow would be visible from outside unless a very strong light source was placed directly behind the figure, which would require intimate knowledge of the room's layout. The journalist's composure finally cracked. What are you suggesting? I suggest nothing yet. But observe, mon ami. Poirot gestured toward Hartwell's feet. Your shoes bear traces of red clay. This particular clay is found only in the rose garden directly beneath Lady Pemberton's window. You were indeed there, as you claim? Then you believe me. I believe you stood in that garden. Whether you climbed up to the window or whether something climbed down to meet you, that remains to be determined. Poirot rose gracefully. Tell me, Monsieur Hartwell, what did you hope to gain if the truth about Lord Pemberton emerged? Justice, Hartwell said quietly, and perhaps redemption for the articles I wrote condemning an innocent man. Or perhaps, Poirot murmured as we prepared to leave, you feared that Lady Pemberton's vindication would expose your own role in destroying her husband's reputation. A journalist who discovers he has been used as a weapon might find himself in a most uncomfortable position, n'est-ce pas? As we exited the library, I could feel Hartwell's eyes burning into our backs. Do you believe him, Poirot? I whispered. He tells part of the truth, mon ami, but in this house of secrets, partial truth can be more dangerous than outright lies. The clay on his shoes confirms his presence beneath the window, but it does not explain how a locked room became a death chamber, or why a midnight visitor brought murder instead of revelation. The conservatory at Greystone Manor provided an oddly tropical refuge from the storm's fury, and through its glass walls streaming with rain while exotic orchids bloomed in humid defiance of the October tempest. Dr. Thornbury awaited us among the ferns and palms, his portly frame settled uncomfortably on a wrought iron bench, his florid face glistening with perspiration despite the reasonable temperature. Dreadful business, Mr. Poirot, he muttered, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. 20 years I've served this family, and never imagined such horror would visit Greystone. Poirot arranged himself with characteristic precision on the opposite bench, his green eyes already cataloguing the physician's obvious discomfort. You examined Lady Pemberton's body immediately after the door was forced, Doctor? What were your findings? Single stab wound directly to the heart, between the 4th and 5th ribs, to be precise. The weapon was that silver letter opener from the library downstairs. Thornbury's hand trembled slightly as he demonstrated the angle. The thrust was upward, suggesting either that the killer was significantly shorter than Lady Pemberton, or was perhaps kneeling when the blow was struck. Lady Pemberton's height was considerable. 5 feet 7 inches. Quite tall for a woman, but Mr. Poirot. The doctor's voice dropped to a whisper. When I examined the body, There was something peculiar, a faint medicinal scent, like ether, and there were no defensive wounds whatsoever. It was as if she offered no resistance. Poirot leaned forward with sudden intensity. No resistance, yet she screamed loudly enough to alert the entire household. That's what troubles me. The scream was genuine, terrified, agonized. No, but her hands showed no signs of struggle, no torn fingernails, no bruising from attempting to ward off an attack. Thornbury mopped his brow again. There's something else. Yesterday morning, Lady Pemberton requested a stronger sedative. I provided a small vial of chloral hydrate to calm her nerves before her midnight appointment. And this vial, gone, vanished from her room, just like that mysterious letter. The doctor's voice cracked with strain. Mr. Poirot, I fear I may have inadvertently provided the means for her incapacitation. Interesting, Poirot murmured. The killer ensures the victim cannot resist, yet allows her to scream, either supreme confidence or supreme carelessness. He began his familiar pacing among the tropical plants. Tell me, Doctor, your knowledge of this family extends beyond mere medical care. Now, does it not? Thornbury shifted uncomfortably. I knew them all well. I even treated Lady Pemberton's late husband during their time in London, before his posting to India. Ah, India, where Lord Pemberton met his unfortunate end in that riding accident. Poirot's tone was deceptively casual. You found his death convincing? The question struck like a physical blow. Colour drained from Thornbury's face as he struggled with some internal conflict. Hugh Pemberton was an exceptional horseman, Mr. Poirot. For such a rider to be thrown on familiar terrain during the monsoon season? He shook his head. The official verdict was accidental death, but I had my doubts. Doubts you shared with his widow? She was not in India when it occurred. I had sent her back to England 3 weeks earlier due to severe nervous exhaustion. And she blamed herself terribly for not being there, said if she had remained, Hugh would still be alive. And now, Poirot observed softly, she too is dead, just as she was about to receive proof of her husband's innocence. Most convenient for someone who profited from Lord Pemberton's disgrace. I don't know what you're implying. I imply nothing yet, Doctor. But tell me, where were you when Lady Pemberton's scream was heard at 5 minutes past midnight? In the library, with the other gentlemen, playing bridge. We had been there since 11 o'clock. Thornbury's voice was barely audible, though I did step out briefly around 11:45, perhaps 10 minutes, to fetch my pipe from my room. Your room being on the same corridor as Lady Pemberton's? 2 doors down, but I saw nothing unusual. The corridor was empty, though... He frowned, remembering. There was a distinct cold draught coming from beneath her door, as if a window were open. Yet when the door was broken down, all windows were latched from within, I pointed out. Precisely, mon ami, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. The windows were latched when the door was broken, but what of the 20 minutes before? What of the time when our good doctor felt that revealing draught? He turned back to Thornbury with surgical precision. Doctor, you mentioned that Lady Pemberton spoke of being watched, of objects moved in her room, of footsteps in the night. Did it not occur to you that someone was systematically undermining her mental state, preparing her mind for terror? I thought it was merely anxiety. Non. Someone in this house has been playing a most cruel psychological game. The murderer who strikes once may be brutal, but the one who first erodes the victim's sanity is an artist of cruelty. Poirot's voice hardened. And such artistry requires intimate knowledge of the victim's fears, her medical needs, her daily routines. The knowledge, perhaps, of a family physician. Thornbury's hands shook violently as he clutched his handkerchief. You cannot seriously suggest. I suggest only that the thrust which killed Lady Pemberton was delivered with anatomical precision, that she was incapacitated beforehand with medical expertise, that the killer knew exactly when she would be alone and vulnerable. Poirot paused by a blood-red orchid. and that someone who treated both husband and wife, who was conveniently absent when one died in India and present when the other was murdered here, it carries the weight of terrible knowledge. As we prepared to leave, Thornbury called out desperately, "Mr. Poirot, if I am suspected, why would I have volunteered the information about the ether scent, about the missing sedative?" Poirot turned back with a slight smile. "Perhaps, mon ami, because you know that others will have noticed these details, and it is better to appear forthcoming than to be caught in concealment. Or perhaps because guilt drives even the cleverest criminal to seek absolution through partial confession." "Outside the conservatory," I whispered, "do you truly suspect him, Poirot?" "I suspect everyone and no one, Hastings. But Dr. Thornbury knows far more than he admits about both deaths. The husband's in India 3 years ago, and the wife's here last night. The question is whether he is murderer, accomplice, or merely the unwitting tool of a more cunning mind." Major Sinclair awaited us in the billiard room, standing at rigid attention beside the mahogany scoring board as though preparing for inspection. The green baize tables gleamed under the amber lamplight, their polished surfaces reflecting the storm's intermittent lightning flashes through the tall windows. He was a man carved from military discipline. Ramrod straight, steel-grey mustache, precisely trimmed, with eyes that held the hard certainty of a career soldier. "Major," Poirot began, settling into a leather chair with deceptive casualness, "you served as Colonel Ashford's adjutant in India for many years, I understand. 15 years of distinguished service." "The finest commanding officer I ever served under," Sinclair replied crisply. "And we saw action together from the northwest frontier to the Punjab, built a trust that survives to this day. And Lord Pemberton, you knew him during his brief posting there." The Major's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hugh Pemberton served under us in 1930 to 31. Brilliant administrator, but—" He paused, selecting his words with military precision. He lacked the hardness necessary for colonial service, too trusting, too eager to see good in everyone. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. A dangerous quality in such an environment, n'est-ce pas? "Tell me, Major, what exactly did Lord Pemberton discover that made his trust so fatal?" The question struck home like a physical blow. Sinclair moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' guilt. "Hugh discovered irregularities in the regimental accounts. Substantial sums meant for local infrastructure projects were being diverted. Had been for years. He came to me 3 weeks before his death, asking my advice." Sinclair's hands clenched behind his back. He had traced the embezzlement to someone high in the administrative chain, someone with access to signatures and authorization codes. "And your counsel?" "I told him to proceed through proper channels, to be absolutely certain before making accusations. I thought I was protecting him by advising caution." The Major's voice cracked slightly. "Instead, I gave the real embezzler time to silence him permanently." Poirot began his characteristic pacing around the billiard table, his fingers trailing along the polished wood. 2 weeks later, Lord Pemberton suffered his convenient riding accident, and then evidence appeared suggesting he himself was the embezzler. Forged documents, manufactured testimony. The official inquiry concluded rapidly. Case closed, reputation destroyed posthumously. I said nothing because I had no proof, only suspicions. Sinclair turned back to face us, his expression haunted. Speaking out would have accomplished nothing except destroying my own career. Yet Lady Pemberton believed otherwise. She believed her husband was murdered and framed, and you, Major, you have carried this guilt for 3 years. "Every day," Sinclair whispered. "She wrote to me repeatedly, begging for any detail that might clear Hugh's name. Each letter was a knife twist of accusation." Poirot stopped directly before him, unstudying the Major's boots with sudden intensity. "You have walked in the rose garden recently, Major. The red clay beneath Lady Pemberton's window is quite distinctive." Sinclair started. Yes. Yesterday evening, before dinner. I sometimes walk there when the house feels oppressive with secrets. And yet Colonel Ashford's boots show only the chalk of the main path. You alone ventured to that secluded spot beneath her balcony. Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Where were you precisely when Lady Pemberton's scream was heard at 5 minutes past midnight? In the library with the others, playing cards. All evening. A hesitation. I stepped out briefly around 11:30. 5 minutes, no more. The lavatory. 5 minutes, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Sufficient time for a man who knew this house well, who understood its hidden passages from years of friendship with the family. Sufficient time to slip upstairs, ensure a door was unlocked, return to establish an alibi. The door was locked from within, Sinclair protested. The key was found inside the room. So it appeared when broken down. But what of the 20 minutes before? What of the time when Dr. Thornbury felt that revealing draught beneath her door? Poirot's eyes bored into the Major's. You are a strategist, trained in deception and misdirection. You know that the best place to hide is often among those who discover the crime. Sinclair's military composure finally cracked. He sank into a chair, his head in his weathered hands. You don't understand the complexities, the loyalties, the impossible choices. I understand that 2 people are dead, and in that misguided loyalty becomes complicity in murder. Poirot's tone was merciless. The name, Major. Give me the name of the person Lord Pemberton suspected. The person whose secret you have protected for 3 years. The Major looked up. His eyes filled with anguish and something else. Relief, perhaps, that the burden might finally be lifted. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any words could emerge, the billiard-room door burst open. Colonel Ashford stood in the doorway, his face ashen with shock. Mr. Poirot, come quickly. There's been another incident. Mrs. Blackwood has collapsed in her sitting room, and there's something else. His voice dropped to a horrified whisper. We found a hypodermic syringe beside her chair and a vial labeled with Dr. Thornbury's name. We hurried through Greystone Manor's shadowed corridors, our footsteps echoing against the oak paneling as Colonel Ashford led us toward the west wing. The storm's fury seemed to have intensified, if such a thing were possible, with thunder rolling across the moors like artillery fire and rain lashing the diamond-paned windows with increasing violence. The very air within the house felt charged with malevolent electricity. Mrs. Blackwood's sitting room presented a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos. The elderly woman lay slumped in her high-backed chair, her sharp features slack with unconsciousness, her knitting scattered across the Persian carpet like the abandoned web of some industrious spider. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her papery eyelids flickered as though she fought to surface from some dark chemical depth. Dr. Thornbury was already kneeling beside her, his florid face glistening with perspiration as his trembling fingers checked her pulse. On the small table beside the chair sat the damning evidence, a half-empty teacup, a small brown vial bearing the doctor's printed label, and a hypodermic syringe lying with theatrical precision on the lace doily. Chloral hydrate, Thornbury announced, his voice cracking with strain. A massive overdose, the same sedative that disappeared from Lady Pemberton's room. But she'll live, thank God. She'll be unconscious for several hours, but she'll recover. Poirot moved to the table with predatory grace, examining the arrangement with his magnifying glass. The same drug, you say? How convenient, and this vial bears your name, Doctor. From your medical bag, I presume. Stolen, Thornbury cried desperately. My bag was in my room all morning. Hardly anyone could have taken it during the confusion after we discovered Lady Pemberton's body. Surely you don't believe I would leave such obvious evidence if I were guilty? Unless, Poirot murmured, his green eyes glinting with dangerous intelligence, you wish to appear the victim of an elaborate frame, or perhaps our murderer grows careless in their haste. He bent low over the teacup, inhaling delicately. The chloral hydrate was mixed directly into the tea. No attempt at concealment. The bitter almond scent is quite distinct. As Dr. Thornbury and I carefully moved Mrs. Blackwood to the small divan, her eyes fluttered open briefly. Her gaze was unfocused, terrified, but she managed to whisper something that made my blood run cold. The shadow, watching from the corridor. Just like that night Eleanor fell. The words struck Colonel Ashford like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his military bearing crumbling as the color drained from his weathered face. "Eleanor," he whispered. "My God, she's talking about Eleanor." Poirot's head snapped up with laser-like intensity. "Eleanor, Colonel? Your late wife, perhaps?" "She died 8 years ago," Ashford replied hoarsely. "A fall down the main staircase. The inquest ruled it accidental, but—" He struggled with the words. "Mrs. Blackwood was staying here that week. She was the one who found Eleanor's body at the bottom of the stairs." "And now," Poirot said softly, beginning his methodical examination of the room, "Mrs. Blackwood speaks of shadows and watchers, connecting your wife's death to recent events. Most illuminating." He moved to Mrs. Blackwood's writing desk, where an unfinished letter lay exposed, the ink still wet where the pen had been hastily abandoned. Reading aloud in his precise accent, he said, "My dearest Constance, I can remain silent no longer about what I witnessed. The pattern repeats itself, and I fear that Eleanor's death was not the accident we believed. What I observed last evening confirms my terrible suspicions. If something should happen to me—" The letter ended abruptly in a dark blot of ink. "Blackmail?" I suggested, though the word felt inadequate. "No, mon ami, not blackmail. Conscience." Mrs. Blackwood was not seeking profit, but justice. She was preparing to reveal a truth that someone has killed twice to conceal. Poirot's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We are not dealing with a crime of passion, mes amis. We face a methodical killer who has murdered before and will murder again to protect their secret." He turned to face the assembled household with those penetrating green eyes. Lady Pemberton was silenced before she could receive proof of her husband's innocence. Mrs. Blackwood was silenced because she connected that murder to an earlier death. "Your wife's death, Colonel. The pattern, as she said, repeats itself." Major Sinclair stepped forward, his military composure restored, but his face grave. "Mr. Poirot, in the billiard room I was about to tell you the name Lord Pemberton suspected of embezzlement in India. Given what we've just heard—" "Was it Eleanor Ashford?" Poirot asked quietly. The Major's silence was confirmation enough. "Impossible!" The voice cracked like a whip from the doorway. Richard Ashford stood there, so his young face twisted with barely controlled fury, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "My mother was no thief. She was a saint who devoted her life to this family and to charitable works in India. Whatever lies the Hugh Pemberton spread, whatever poison Lady Pemberton was about to receive, whatever delusions Mrs. Blackwood harbors, they're all fabrications designed to destroy her memory." Poirot studied the young man with clinical interest. "Yet you seem remarkably well informed about these fabrications, Monsieur Richard. Tell me, where were you last evening between 11:30 and midnight? Your father mentions that the card game was interrupted briefly, that players left the table at various times." "I was there the entire time," Richard replied, but a nervous tic had developed beneath his left eye. "Ask anyone." "But that is precisely what I cannot do," Poirot observed with deadly calm. "For Major Sinclair admits to leaving for 5 minutes, Dr. Thornbury for 10, Mr. Hartwell for 20. In such a fluid situation, a clever man might slip away unnoticed, particularly if he knew the house's hidden passages as intimately as a son would." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Richard's composure finally cracked completely, and he sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You don't understand what it's like to live under the shadow of whispered accusations, to see your mother's reputation slowly destroyed by innuendo and speculation." "Then perhaps," Poirot said gently, "you should tell us what you do understand. What you saw, what you know, what you have been trying so desperately to protect. But before Richard could respond, Margaret Ashford appeared in the doorway, her face pale as parchment, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to encompass far more than the immediate crisis. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Oh, Richard, what have you done?" Margaret Ashford stood in the doorway like a figure carved from marble, her aristocratic composure finally cracking under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear alone. The storm's fury seemed to echo the turmoil within her, casting shifting shadows across her pale features as lightning illuminated the rain-streaked windows behind her. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Nah, I cannot watch you destroy yourself with lies any longer." Her husband rose from his chair with the jerky movements of a marionette, his face cycling through expressions of panic, pleading, and desperate calculation. "Margaret, please, you don't understand the complexities." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, stepping into the room with newfound resolve. "I understand that you left our bed at 11:15 last night, that you used the servants' passage behind the library to reach the upper floors undetected, and that you returned at 20 minutes past midnight with your hands shaking so violently you could barely hold your brandy glass." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with predatory interest. "Most illuminating, madame. You observed your husband's movements with considerable precision for someone who claimed to be asleep." Margaret's composure wavered slightly. I was worried about him. He had been so agitated since Lady Pemberton's arrival, so consumed with protecting his mother's memory. I feared he might do something rash. "And did he?" Poirot inquired with deceptive gentleness. "I don't know." The words burst from her like a dam breaking. "When he returned, his clothes were damp with rain, and there was something in his manner, a wildness, a terror I had never seen before. He kept muttering about shadows and locked doors and things that couldn't be undone." Richard sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. "You were supposed to be asleep," he said brokenly. "You weren't supposed to know." "Know what, monsieur?" Poirot pressed. "What occurred during those 65 minutes when you were absent from your bed?" "I went to reason with her," Richard replied, his voice muffled by his palms. "Lady Pemberton had been spreading poison about my mother for months, and now she claimed to have proof of mother's guilt. I couldn't allow it." "So you visited her room?" "Yes. But she was alive when I left her. Alive and laughing at my pleas, mocking my devotion to mother's memory." Richard looked up with haunted eyes. "She said the truth would emerge at midnight, whether I liked it or not. That her visitor would vindicate Hugh Pemberton and expose the real embezzler." Poirot began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "And yet, when her scream was heard at 5 minutes past midnight, you were seated in the library with the other gentlemen, and apparently having been there all evening." "Because I knew how it would appear. I was the last person to see her alive. I had clear motive, I had opportunity. Who would believe my innocence?" "Your wife might have," Poirot observed quietly. "Had you trusted her with the truth?" Margaret moved to her husband's side, her hand hovering uncertainly over his shoulder. "There's more, isn't there, Richard? Something you haven't told them about what you saw in Lady Pemberton's room?" Richard's face went ashen. "Margaret, no. Tell them about the window," she urged desperately. "Tell them what you discovered about the locked room." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Even the storm seemed to pause, as though nature itself awaited the revelation. "The window," Poirot repeated softly. "Ah, yes, and the windows that were found latched from within when the door was broken down. But perhaps, Monsieur Richard, they were not latched when you visited the room at 11:45. Richard's shoulders sagged in defeat. "The east window was open when I arrived. Not wide, just a few inches, but enough to let in the rain. Lady Pemberton was standing beside it, looking out into the storm as though expecting someone." "And when you left?" "It was still open. She said she was waiting for her midnight visitor, that they would come that way if necessary. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought she was being melodramatic. I never imagined someone would actually climb up to her balcony. Yet someone did, Poirot mused. Someone who entered through that window, committed murder, and then somehow managed to latch it from within before escaping through. Where? The room was locked from inside, the windows secured, the chimney too narrow for passage. That's what I've been trying to understand, Richard said desperately. How could someone enter and leave a locked room? It's impossible. No, mon ami. Not impossible, merely ingenious. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But we shall leave that revelation for the proper moment. For now, I'm more interested in what else you observed during your clandestine visit. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but determined. Show them, Richard. Show them what you found on her dressing table. With trembling hands, Richard reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small brass key, ornate and old-fashioned. This was lying beside her jewelry box. She said it opened something that would change everything, but she wouldn't tell me what. Poirot accepted the key with reverent care, examining it through his magnifying glass. Most interesting. This is not a modern key, but rather something from an earlier era. The metalwork suggests late Victorian craftsmanship. He looked up sharply. Colonel Ashford, do you recognize this key? The colonel studied it with growing bewilderment. It looks familiar, but I cannot place it. Perhaps something from my father's time. Or perhaps, Poirot suggested, something that opens a hiding place where certain compromising documents might be concealed. Documents that someone has been searching for desperately. The implications hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Blackwood stirred slightly on the divan, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, and in her drugged state, she mumbled something that chilled us all. Eleanor's secret, behind the false panel, the letters from India. What letters? Colonel Ashford demanded, his military bearing reasserting itself. What secret? But Mrs. Blackwood had lapsed back into unconsciousness, leaving only questions in her wake. Poirot pocketed the brass key with evident satisfaction. The pattern becomes clearer, mes amis. We have a locked room murder, a missing letter, a mysterious midnight visitor, and now a key that opens some hidden cache of secrets. Add to this Mrs. Blackwood's drugged ravings about Eleanor's correspondence from India, and we begin to see the true scope of our mystery. He turned to face the assembled company with those penetrating green eyes. In 1 hour, we shall gather in the library for the final revelation. By then, I shall demonstrate not only how the impossible locked room was achieved, but why 3 people have died to protect secrets that should have remained buried with Eleanor Ashford 8 years ago. As we prepared to leave Mrs. Blackwood's sitting room, I noticed that Richard and Margaret exchanged a look of such profound terror that I knew whatever truth Poirot was about to reveal would shatter far more than just this investigation. The storm continued to rage outside, but I sensed that the tempest within Greystone Manor was only beginning to reach its crescendo. The hour before the final gathering found Poirot in Eleanor Ashford's abandoned sitting room, a shrine to order and refinement that had remained untouched since her death 8 years prior. Colonel Ashford stood reluctantly in the doorway, not his military bearing unable to mask the pain of revisiting his wife's sanctuary. She spent countless hours here, the colonel said quietly, his voice heavy with memory. Letters to charitable organizations in India, correspondence with old friends, managing household accounts with meticulous precision. Poirot moved through the space with predatory grace, his green eyes cataloguing every detail. The room spoke of a woman who demanded control over her environment. Books arranged by height, porcelain figurines spaced with mathematical exactness, writing materials aligned with military precision. Yet something disturbs the perfect order, Poirot murmured, approaching an ornate cabinet filled with Indian souvenirs. He traced the dust patterns along its base with his finger. This cabinet has been moved recently. Despite your assertion that the room remains untouched, Impossible, the colonel protested. I keep it locked. No one enters without my permission. No one you know of, Poirot corrected, producing the brass key Richard had surrendered. But Lady Pemberton possessed this key, and she knew of secrets hidden within these walls. With the colonel's reluctant assistance, they moved the cabinet forward. Behind it, a section of wainscoting showed a hairline seam, nearly invisible unless one searched deliberately. The brass key fit perfectly into a concealed escutcheon, and with a soft click, a narrow panel swung open. Within the hidden compartment lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, a small leather ledger, yes, and a single sheet bearing Hugh Pemberton's familiar handwriting, to be opened only in the event of my death. Colonel Ashford made a strangled sound as Poirot carefully examined the contents. The letters, written in Eleanor's precise hand, told a story of mounting desperation and moral compromise that painted her final months in tragic new light. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered as he read. Your wife was not the architect of the embezzlement, Colonel. She was its victim. These letters reveal she was being systematically blackmailed by someone who knew a devastating secret from her past. Something that would have destroyed not only her reputation, but the family's standing entirely. The colonel sank into his wife's chair, aged beyond his years. Blackmail, but Eleanor never mentioned. Because she was protecting you and your son from the truth, the blackmailer demanded money, and when Eleanor could not provide enough from household accounts, she was forced to divert regimental funds. When Lord Pemberton discovered the discrepancies, she panicked. Poirot's voice carried infinite sadness. The blackmailer offered a solution: frame Pemberton, and the investigation would conclude quietly. She agreed to that. To the framing, yes, but never to murder. Hugh Pemberton's death was the blackmailer's independent decision, one that horrified Eleanor. These final letters show she planned to confess everything, to clear his name posthumously. Poirot carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. But before she could act, she suffered her convenient fall down the stairs. Then her death was also murder? Certainement. The blackmailer could not allow her confession. For 8 years, the secret remained buried, until Lady Pemberton's investigation threatened to expose the truth. Poirot checked his pocket watch with satisfaction. The little grey cells have done their work, mon ami. Now we shall see if our murderer's nerve holds when confronted with irrefutable logic and the weight of 3 deaths upon their conscience. The storm continued its relentless assault on Greystone Manor, but inside, the final act of this tragic drama was about to unfold. The library at Greystone Manor had transformed into an amphitheater of judgment, its book-lined walls bearing witness to secrets that had festered for 8 years. The storm's fury had finally begun to abate, though occasional thunder still rumbled across the moors like distant artillery. Each member of the household sat in their appointed place, faces etched with exhaustion and fear, while Poirot stood before the great fireplace like a conductor preparing his final movement. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, we gather to solve not one crime, but a symphony of murders spanning 8 years and 3 continents. The key lies not in physical evidence, but in understanding the psychology of a mind twisted by greed and corrupted by power. His green eyes moved methodically from face to face. Let us begin with the locked room, since this impossibility has troubled us all. Lady Pemberton's chamber was found secured from within, door locked, windows latched, no apparent means of entry or escape. Yet Monsieur Richard has told us the east window was open when he visited at 11:45. Richard shifted uncomfortably. She was alive then, I swear it. Indeed, she was alive, but not alone. Poirot began his characteristic pacing. The person standing by that window, silhouetted against the storm, was not Lady Pemberton. In the dim lamplight, with rain obscuring visibility, you mistook the murderer for the victim. Someone of similar height and build, wearing her dressing gown, deliberately positioned to deceive you. Margaret gasped. But who could? Someone with intimate knowledge of this house. Someone who had been planning this deception for days. Someone who knew that Monsieur Richard would come to plead with Lady Pemberton, providing the perfect witness to establish an alibi. Poirot paused by the window. So after Richard departed, the murderer completed their work. They stabbed Lady Pemberton with a library letter opener, arranged her body, then faced the challenge of creating an impossible locked room. Dr. Thornbury leaned forward, his face glistening with perspiration. But how? The windows were latched from inside when we broke down the door. Ah, Doctor, you asked the right question, but for the wrong reason. Poirot's eyes fixed on the physician with laser intensity. The windows were indeed latched from within, but not by the murderer's hand. They were latched by Lady Pemberton herself, in her final moments of life. The silence was electric with tension. You see, Lady Pemberton was not killed at midnight, but at 20 minutes past 11, just after Richard left her room. She was attacked, mortally wounded, but not yet dead. The killer whispered instructions. Latch the windows, lock the door, and scream at exactly 5 minutes past midnight. If she complied, her death would be swift. If not, Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The killer would ensure her nephew Richard was framed for her murder. Colonel Ashford's face had gone ashen. You're saying she locked herself in with her killer? Non, mon ami. She locked herself in with her killer's voice, a voice she trusted completely, a voice that had guided her medical care for 20 years. Poirot turned slowly to face Dr. Thornbury, the voice of her family physician, who used a small dose of his own morphine to ensure she would die at precisely the right moment, who positioned himself in the corridor to discover the locked room with the rest of you. Doctor. Thornbury's hands began to tremble violently. This is preposterous. I was in the library with the other gentlemen. You were in the library when the scream was heard, yes. But you had left 20 minutes earlier, ostensibly to fetch your pipe. 20 minutes, ample time to complete your grisly work and return to establish your alibi. Poirot's voice carried the weight of inexorable logic. You alone possessed the medical knowledge to time a death so precisely. You alone had access to the drugs found in Lady Pemberton's system. You alone knew that her heart condition would respond predictably to morphine administered in a specific dosage. The doctor's florid face had turned the color of old parchment. Even if what you say were true, what possible motive? The same motive that drove you to murder Eleanor Ashford 8 years ago, ours and Hugh Pemberton 3 years before that. Poirot produced the bundle of letters from Eleanor's hidden compartment. You were Eleanor's blackmailer, Doctor. You discovered some secret from her past. Perhaps medical records showing she had borne a child before her marriage. Perhaps evidence of a previous marriage she had concealed. You used this knowledge to extort money from her, and when her personal funds were exhausted, you forced her to embezzle from the regimental accounts. Colonel Ashford made a strangled sound. Eleanor, blackmailed? When Lord Pemberton discovered the discrepancies, you offered Eleanor a solution. Frame him for the embezzlement, and you would ensure the investigation concluded quietly. But Hugh Pemberton was too honest, too persistent. He continued investigating, came too close to the truth. So you arranged his riding accident in India, where you were conveniently visiting to treat other British families. Major Sinclair stepped forward, his military bearing intact, but his face grave. The riding accident was no accident. I suspected as much at the time. Eleanor was horrified by her husband's murder, but you had her trapped. She planned to confess everything to clear Hugh's name posthumously. So you pushed her down these very stairs, making it appear accidental. Poirot's voice carried infinite sadness. For 8 years you thought yourself safe. Then Lady Pemberton began her investigation, threatening to expose the truth about her husband's innocence. You could not allow that. Dr. Thornbury rose unsteadily from his chair, his medical bag clutched in trembling hands. You cannot prove any of this. It's all speculation, with psychological theories. No, Doctor, it is logic, supported by evidence you yourself provided. Poirot gestured to Major Sinclair. Show him the rope, Major. Sinclair produced a length of thin cord from behind the bookshelf. Found this hidden in the doctor's medical bag when I searched the rooms this morning, still damp from last night's rain, with fibers matching those on the window latch. Your backup plan, Poirot explained. If Lady Pemberton had refused to cooperate, you were prepared to create the locked room mechanically, climbing down from her window and using this cord to latch it from outside. But psychological manipulation proved more effective than physical deception. The doctor's composure finally cracked completely. His hand emerged from his medical bag holding a small pistol. I won't hang for this, Poirot. I'm 70 years old with a failing heart. Prison would kill me anyway. Then perhaps, Poirot suggested gently, you should consider that justice sometimes wears the face of mercy. Before anyone could react, Colonel Ashford moved with military precision, his service revolver appearing in his steady hand. Doctor, you will put down that weapon immediately. I will not have another death in my house. The confrontation lasted only seconds. Dr. Thornbury, faced with the Colonel's unwavering resolve and the weight of his exposed crimes, slowly lowered the pistol. He sank back into his chair, weeping brokenly as 20 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around him. Eleanor was innocent, the Colonel said quietly, his voice heavy with grief and relief. At least of murder. She was a victim, mon ami, Poirot replied softly. As were they all, victims of one man's greed and moral corruption, trapped in a web of blackmail and fear. As the local constabulary arrived to take Dr. Thornbury into custody, Poirot stood by the tall windows watching dawn break over the rain-washed moors. The storm had passed, leaving the world cleansed and new, though the scars within Greystone Manor would take far longer to heal. Another case concluded, Poirot, I said, joining him at the window. Oui, Hastings, but at what cost? 3 lives destroyed, a family's honor nearly shattered, all because one man chose profit over principle, fear over courage. He adjusted his mustaches with characteristic precision. The little grey cells can solve the puzzle, mon ami, but they cannot mend the broken hearts left in murder's wake. He turned from the window with a slight smile. Sir, but perhaps in time, truth will prove more healing than the lies that have poisoned this house for so long. The midnight guest brought death, as predicted, but also, finally, justice.